The neutron star's accretion disk painted the celestial atrium in shades of blue and violet that hurt to look at directly, colors that existed at frequencies human eyes weren't quite designed to process. Commander Jackson Vale stood at the observation port anyway, watching plasma spiral into oblivion while his brain tried to convince him this was real, that he was actually here, representing Earth at a summit with 47 alien civilizations, most of whom had been traveling between stars when humanity was still figuring out agriculture. Commander Vale, his aide, Lieutenant Chen, appeared at his elbow with a datapad that glowed with the day's briefing schedule. The opening ceremonies begin in 20 minutes. Protocol reminds us that Earth's delegation should arrive precisely on time, not early, not late. Apparently, temporal precision is considered a sign of respect among the Xyloth, and they're hosting. Vale accepted the datapad, scanning the list of attendees. Most were species he'd only read about in the crash course Xenocultural Training Earth's diplomatic corps had put him through. 3 weeks to learn the basics of 47 different civilizations, their customs, their histories, their current political positions. He'd barely scratched the surface. Then he saw one name that made him pause. Queen Velshara, Talvirian sovereignty. He'd spent more time on Talvirian culture than any other species, not because they were politically significant, though they were, controlling some of the most advanced military technology in the known galaxy, but because something about their traditions had caught his attention. The ceremonial scarring, the way they literally wore their history on their skin. Lieutenant, the Talvirian delegation, what's the current diplomatic temperature there? Chen's expression tightened. Cold, sir. Most species avoid direct interaction. The Queen's appearance makes delegates uncomfortable. Her scars. Yes, sir. Cultural sensitivity briefings suggest maintaining minimal eye contact and keeping conversations brief and formal. Chen hesitated. Some species consider the scarring barbaric. There have been incidents at previous summits. Vale thought about his grandfather, about the way people used to cross the street rather than face the man who'd fought in the Pacific Theater, whose scars told stories he never wanted to speak aloud. Incidents meaning what? Delegations refusing to meet with her, requests that she cover the markings for diplomatic photographs. Last summit, the Cephian ambassador reportedly suggested cosmetic reconstruction as a gesture of goodwill toward interspecies harmony. That's disgusting. That's politics, sir. The opening ceremony took place in a chamber that defied Euclidean geometry. Walls curved in ways that suggested dimensions Vale's three-dimensional thinking couldn't quite process, the space somehow feeling both intimate and vast. Delegations arranged themselves in clusters based on alliance networks and historical relationships, the social geography of galactic politics made visible in seating arrangements. Earth's delegation was small. Vale, Chen, and 2 junior diplomats whose job was mostly to look attentive and take notes. They were positioned near other minor species, the ones whose influence was measured in potential rather than power. Then Queen Velshara entered, and the room's energy changed. She was tall, taller than most humans, though not unusual by Korvathi standards, with the kind of bearing that suggested military training so deeply ingrained it had become her natural state. Her formal robes were beautiful, deep purple fabric that caught the light in ways that suggested technology woven into the threads. But what everyone noticed, what made conversations stutter and gazes avert, were the scars. They covered her face like a map written in raised tissue. Parallel lines along her left temple, a spiral pattern on her right cheek, intricate geometric designs that flowed down her neck, and across what little skin the formal robes exposed. Each mark was deliberate, precise, clearly created with purpose rather than violence. Vale watched as delegates turned away, as conversation stopped mid-sentence, as an entire room full of sophisticated beings who prided themselves on cultural tolerance demonstrated exactly how shallow that tolerance went. The Cephian ambassador, a being whose translucent skin revealed the bioluminescent organs beneath, literally turned his back when Velshara approached his delegation. The Xyloth, usually so meticulous about protocol, suddenly discovered urgent business on the far side of the chamber. Velshara moved through it all with perfect composure, her expression carefully neutral. But Vale noticed the way her long ears, pointed, mobile, the only visible difference between Talvirians and humans besides the scars, angled slightly backward. In his crash course on Talvirian body language, he'd learned that meant withdrawal, protection, the physical equivalent of pulling into defensive posture. Her small advisory council trailed behind her, their own faces unmarked, younger Talvirians who'd grown up in Galactic society and rejected the traditional scarring. They looked uncomfortable, whispering among themselves, clearly wishing their queen would just blend in. The ceremony proceeded with typical diplomatic pageantry, speeches about cooperation, unity, the shared threats facing all civilized species. The Kresh swarm was mentioned repeatedly, a parasitic species consuming resources across the outer rim, their hive clusters spreading like infection through undefended systems. Vale listened with half his attention while his eyes kept drifting to Velshara. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing. But he noticed the way she touched the spiral scar on her right cheek once briefly, when the Cephian ambassador suggested that traditional approaches to the Kresh threat had proven insufficient. It was a dig barely concealed. Talvirian forces had been fighting the Kresh for decades with more success than any other military. But that success came at a cost written in scars across their queen's face. After the ceremony, there was a reception, the kind of mandatory social event where real diplomacy happened in clusters of conversation, while servers circulated with refreshments designed to be chemically compatible with as many species biologies as possible. Vale found himself studying the room's social dynamics like a tactical problem. Alliance networks formed visible clusters. Trade relationships created bridges between groups. Political tensions manifested as carefully maintained distances. And in the center of it all, isolated like a stone in a stream, stood Queen Velshara. He made a decision. "Sir." Chen materialized at his elbow, concern evident. "What are you doing?" "Introducing myself to our fellow delegates," Vale said, already moving. "The briefing specifically advised." "I read the briefing. I'm choosing to ignore it." Vale approached each delegation cluster with appropriate protocol, offering the correct greeting gestures, making brief conversation about Earth's position on various summit issues. He worked his way methodically across the room, aware that everyone was watching to see how the human delegation handled the social navigation. When he finally reached Velshara, the nearby conversations went quiet. Up close, the scars were even more intricate than they'd appeared from a distance. The parallel lines along her temple weren't random. They formed a pattern that matched the ancient Talvirian script for endurance. The spiral on her cheek incorporated elements that resembled military unit insignia. The geometric designs flowing down her neck told stories in a language written on skin instead of paper. Vale stopped at the prescribed diplomatic distance. Then, instead of the standard neutral bow Earth's protocol officers had drilled into him, he brought his right fist to his chest, extended it forward, and opened his palm. A human military salute modified with elements he'd seen in recordings of Talvirian honor guards greeting their queen. The room went absolutely silent. Vale spoke in carefully learned Talvirian, his pronunciation rough but sincere. "Your Majesty, the marks of your service honor us all." For a moment, Velshara didn't move. Her amber eyes, startling in their intensity, almost luminous in the chamber's lighting, widened slightly. Her ears angled forward in undisguised surprise. Then her carefully controlled expression cracked, just slightly, and Vale saw something he suspected few people ever witnessed. Genuine emotion breaking through diplomatic armor. Commander Vale, she said, her voice carrying an accent that made the words sound like music. Your greeting is unexpected. I hope not inappropriate. Earth's cultural database on Talvirian customs is incomplete, so I improvised based on what I could learn. He lowered his hand but maintained eye contact. I wanted to convey respect, not just acknowledgement. One of her advisors, a younger Talvirian with an unmarked face and anxious expression, stepped forward. Commander, the Queen appreciates the gesture, but perhaps we should observe standard protocol. Minister Kelth, Vilshara said quietly, I can speak for myself. The advisor retreated, chastened. Vilshara studied Vale with open curiosity now, the diplomatic mask sliding back into place but not completely closed. You studied Talvirian customs for this summit. I studied your face, Vale corrected gently, and heard the sharp intake of breath from someone nearby. The scars aren't random. Each pattern corresponds to specific achievements or events in Talvirian tradition. The 4 parallel lines along your left temple, those match the symbol for the Void Wars. The spiral on your right shoulder, the part I can see above your collar, that's the mark of someone who's taken the oath of protection. The silence in the chamber had quality to it now, not just surprise but shock. No one talked about the scars. Certainly no one studied them openly. You're correct, Vilshara said, her tone carefully neutral but her ears still angled forward. You did your homework, Commander. When I learned I'd be meeting you, I spent 3 weeks with every available text on Talvirian culture. Your people don't hide your history, you wear it. Seemed important to learn how to read it properly. The Cephian ambassador chose that moment to insert himself into the conversation, his bioluminescent organs pulsing with what Vale's cultural training suggested was agitation. Commander Vale, perhaps we could discuss Earth's position on the Kresh containment proposal. The coalition would value human perspective. It was a transparent attempt to separate him from Vilshara, to end this uncomfortable breach of unstated protocol. Vale recognized the maneuver but couldn't directly refuse without causing a diplomatic incident. Of course, Ambassador, he said. Then, turning back to Vilshara, Your Majesty, I hope we can continue this conversation later. I'd like to understand more about Talvirian strategic thinking regarding the Kresh situation. I would welcome that discussion, Commander. The smallest hint of a smile touched her features. It's been some time since anyone asked for Talvirian strategic analysis, rather than simply demanding military deployment. As Vale allowed himself to be drawn into the Cephian delegation's orbit, he glanced back once. Vilshara stood watching him, her expression thoughtful, her hand unconsciously touching the spiral scar on her cheek. Around her, the social isolation remained. But something had shifted. Other delegates were looking at her differently now, reassessing, reconsidering. The human had done something no one else had dared. He'd looked directly at the scars and seen honor instead of disfigurement. It was a small moment in a vast diplomatic gathering. But sometimes, Vale thought, the most important moments were the ones that happened in the spaces between official policy. When someone chose to see another person instead of a category, when understanding mattered more than comfort. The reception continued around them, conversations flowing like currents, alliances forming and reforming in the eternal dance of galactic politics. But in that brief exchange, something had changed. The scarred queen, isolated for 20 years, had found someone who understood what those marks truly meant. And the human commander, representing a species barely a century into interstellar travel, had just made the most important diplomatic gesture of his career, not by following protocol, but by choosing to truly see. The summit's working sessions began the next morning in conference chambers that rearranged themselves based on the number of attendees and their species-specific environmental needs. Vale found himself in a room where gravity fluctuated slightly depending on proximity to different seating areas. The Xyloth preferred lower gravity, while the massive Chronar delegates needed something closer to 2 standard Gs, just to remain comfortable. The agenda focused on the Kresh threat, coordinating military responses, establishing quarantine zones, debating whether diplomatic engagement was even possible with a species that seemed to operate on pure consumption instinct. The discussions had the practiced tedium of arguments that had been repeated so many times everyone knew their lines. Vale noticed that Velshara sat through it all with patient attention, taking notes on a datapad that seemed to respond to her thoughts rather than touch. When the Cephian ambassador proposed a coordinated military offensive, she made no comment. When the Xyloth delegation suggested attempting communication with Kresh hive clusters, her expression remained neutral. But during a brief recess, when most delegates clustered in their familiar groups, Vale saw Minister Kelth approach his queen with obvious anxiety. They spoke in low tones, but Vale's position near a support column gave him inadvertent access to their conversation. "The human's greeting yesterday has created complications," Kelth said, his unmarked face showing distress. "Several delegations are asking if Earth has aligned with Talvirian interests. Others suggest Commander Vale simply doesn't understand proper protocol." "And what do you think it meant, Kelth?" Velshara's voice was quiet but carried an edge. "I think he was being kind, Your Majesty. Humans are known for emotional gestures." Vale watched Velshara's ears angle backward. That defensive posture he'd learned meant hurt feelings or withdrawal. The word kind had landed wrong, suggesting pity rather than respect. Before he could decide whether to intervene or maintain diplomatic distance, another delegate approached Velshara. This time someone Vale didn't recognize, from a species whose database entry he apparently hadn't reached in his 3 weeks of cramming. The being made a gesture that looked like apology and spoke in a language Vale's translator struggled to parse. Velshara responded with the kind of graciousness that came from years of practice smoothing over uncomfortable situations. But Vale noticed the weariness in her posture, the way she held herself like someone expecting blows from all directions. He made another decision that his diplomatic training would probably categorize as inadvisable. "Your Majesty," Vale said, approaching with the casual directness that humans excelled at and which made protocol officers nervous. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I was hoping to ask about your thoughts on the Cephian military proposal." Minister Kelth's expression suggested Vale had just committed a significant breach of etiquette, but Velshara's ears angled forward, interest, attention. "The Cephian proposal," she said slowly, "assumes that Kresh hive clusters operate under unified command. They don't. Military force against one cluster simply drives the others to adapt their tactics. So a purely military solution would be ineffective. Worse than ineffective, it would be counterproductive." She spoke with the certainty of someone who'd fought the Kresh for decades, but suggesting diplomatic engagement without understanding Kresh biology is equally foolish. They're not a traditional civilization. They're more like aggressive cancer with spaceflight capability. Vale couldn't help but smile at the analogy. "That's the most concise threat assessment I've heard all morning. I've had considerable practice making threat assessments." Her hand moved unconsciously to the scar along her jawline, a gesture Vale was beginning to recognize as unconscious self-soothing. "Though apparently my expertise is valued more for its shock value than its strategic merit." The bitterness in her tone was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Vale glanced around the conference chamber, noting how other delegates still maintained careful distance from the Talvirian queen, how conversation stopped when she moved through the room. "Permission to speak candidly, Your Majesty." Velshara's eyebrows rose. "You've been anything but candid so far." "Fair point." Vale lowered his voice. "The way this summit treats you is absurd. You have more combat experience against the Kresh than everyone here combined, but half the delegations won't even look at you directly. And the ones who do seem to think your scars are something to be tolerated rather than respected." Minister Kelth made a small sound of alarm. "Commander, perhaps." "It's fine, Kelth," Velshara said, her attention fixed on Vale. The commander is simply stating what everyone thinks but won't say aloud. No, Vale corrected. I'm stating what everyone should be ashamed of thinking. Your scars aren't a diplomatic inconvenience. They're a record of service that most of these delegates couldn't comprehend. Every mark represents something you survived, some sacrifice you made for your people. That's not barbaric. That's the most honorable tradition I can imagine. The silence that followed was broken by the chime indicating the session would resume. Delegates began filtering back to their seats, conversations trailing off as attention returned to official business. But Velshara remained still, studying Vale with an expression he couldn't quite read. Why? She asked quietly. Earth has nothing to gain from aligning with Talviria. We're isolated, our traditions seen as primitive. Supporting us costs you political capital. Vale thought about his answer for a moment. My grandfather was a Marine. He fought in a war long before humanity reached the stars. He came home with scars, physical and otherwise. Had medals too, honors, recognition for battles that saved lives and turned tides. But people would cross the street to avoid him, not because he'd done anything wrong, because his scars made them uncomfortable, reminded them of violence they wanted to forget. He met her eyes directly. He used to say that people who have never fought for anything don't understand that scars are just proof you survived what should have killed you. When I saw your face yesterday, Your Majesty, I didn't see disfigurement. I saw someone who stood between danger and her people so many times it became written in her skin. That's not something to tolerate. That's something to honor. Velshara's carefully controlled expression cracked again, just slightly. Her ears angled forward, fully attentive now, and for a moment Vale saw past the diplomatic armor to the person beneath. Someone who'd carried isolation for so long, she'd almost forgotten what genuine understanding felt like. Your grandfather sounds like someone I would have valued knowing, she said softly. He would have recognized you immediately, would have saluted those scars the same way I did because he understood what they meant. The session was starting. Delegates were settling into their seats, the chamber's ambient noise shifting from conversation to formal attention. But Velshara remained standing for a moment longer, her gaze holding Vale's. Thank you, Commander, she said, for seeing what others refused to acknowledge. As they moved to their respective seating areas, Vale noticed something. Several delegates who'd been avoiding Velshara were now glancing at her, with expressions that suggested reassessment. The human's open respect hadn't gone unnoticed. Political calculations were being recalibrated. The afternoon session devolved into the same circular arguments: military response versus diplomatic engagement, resource allocation debates, territorial disputes about who would control quarantine zones. Vale found himself doodling in his physical notebook, the tactile process of pen on paper helping him think better than holographic displays. He was sketching the pattern of Velshara's temple scars, trying to understand the geometric principles behind their design, when Lieutenant Chen leaned over and whispered, "Sir, you're being watched." Vale didn't look up. By who? Half the room, and the Queen hasn't taken her eyes off you for the past 10 minutes. Now Vale did glance up, catching Velshara's gaze from across the chamber. She didn't look away, didn't pretend she'd been focused elsewhere. Instead, one corner of her mouth quirked upward, the smallest hint of amusement. She'd noticed him sketching her scars and apparently found it more interesting than the circular debate about creche containment protocols. Vale found himself smiling back, a shared moment of understanding that this entire summit was somewhat absurd, that they were surrounded. He wasn't alone for long. Your advisor mentioned you don't drink stimulants after third rotation, Velshara said, appearing beside him with 2 steaming cups in her hands. This is Talvirian red tea. Took me an hour to find someone who knew how to prepare it properly. Vale accepted the cup, startled by the gesture. You brought me tea. You honored my scars yesterday. Seemed like a reciprocal gesture was appropriate. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the accretion disk spiral. The tea was bitter and sweet simultaneously, with undertones of something Vale's earth-trained palate identified as possibly cinnamon, but probably wasn't. "Can I ask you something personal?" Vilshara said finally. "After you brought me tea, I think we're past formal boundaries. When you saluted my scars yesterday, was that calculated? A political move to distinguish Earth's position?" Vale considered the question carefully. "Honest answer. I knew it would have political implications. But that's not why I did it. I did it because someone needed to acknowledge what those marks represent, and I couldn't stand watching an entire room full of supposedly civilized beings pretend you were something to be avoided. Most beings would have made the political calculation and stayed silent, safer that way. Probably, but I didn't come to the stars to play it safe. I came because I was tired of predictable trajectories, comfortable certainties, knowing exactly how every day would unfold." He took a sip of tea. "Besides, sometimes the right thing and the safe thing aren't the same. My grandfather taught me that too." Vilshara was quiet for a long moment, her ears angling through subtle shifts that Vale was starting to recognize as processing, thinking, deciding. "These marks," she said finally, touching the spiral on her cheek, "they cost me everything that would have made diplomacy easier. My advisors were right about that. If I'd rejected the traditional scarring, I could have built alliances, avoided isolation. But I chose to honor my people's ways, and I've paid for that choice every day since." "Do you regret it?" "I regret the loneliness," she said quietly. "Not the scars themselves. Each mark has meaning. This one," she touched her jawline, "I earned holding a bunker entrance while civilians evacuated during the Void Wars. Held it for 6 hours while debris collapsed around me. Lost 2 members of my personal guard. But 300 civilians made it to the transport ships. And the spiral on your shoulder. The oath of protection. Every Talvirian ruler takes it when they accept the crown. It's a ritual scarring that represents taking responsibility for every life under your protection. The pattern incorporates elements from every previous ruler's oath scar, a continuous thread connecting me to ancestors who faced similar burdens." Vale found himself seeing the scars differently now, not as static marks but as living history, each one a chapter in a story written on skin instead of paper. "That's extraordinary, and everyone here sees it as barbaric. Most of my own advisors see it that way now. Kelth's generation grew up in galactic society. They rejected the traditional marking because they wanted to fit in, to be accepted without the burden of looking different." She met his eyes. "Until this summit, I don't think anyone has truly seen me in 20 years. They see the scarred queen, the warrior monarch, the barbaric leader, but not me." "I see you," Vale said simply. "A leader who carries her people's history on her skin, because it matters more than comfort. Someone who'd rather stand alone with integrity than compromise for convenience." The words hung between them, more intimate than Vale had intended but true nonetheless. Vilshara studied him with those luminous amber eyes, her expression cycling through surprise, recognition, something that might have been gratitude. "Your species is very strange, Jackson Vale," she said, using his given name for the first time. "But perhaps strange is what this summit needs." They stood watching the neutron star spiral into night, 2 leaders carrying weights the others couldn't see, finding unexpected understanding in the space between human and alien, between protocol and genuine connection. And in that moment, the isolation Vilshara had carried for 2 decades cracked just slightly, letting in the possibility that maybe, finally, someone understood what those scars truly meant. The 3rd day of the summit brought the main session to its breaking point. The Cephian delegation formally proposed a military offensive, coordinated strikes against identified Kresh hive clusters, with Talvirian forces leading the assault while other species provided support and resources from safe distances. It was transparently self-serving. The Cephians would claim credit for the initiative while Talvirian warriors bore the actual cost, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Velshara sat through the presentation with her typical composure, her datapad recording notes, her expression revealing nothing. But Vale noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her ears angled backward incrementally, as the Cephian ambassador outlined casualty projections that treated Talvirian lives as acceptable losses. When the proposal was opened for debate, the Xyloth delegation immediately countered with their own plan: diplomatic engagement with Kresh hive clusters, based on the theory that their resource consumption could be managed through negotiated territory agreements. With respect, the Xyloth ambassador said, his chitinous form shifting colors to indicate sincerity, military force has been attempted for decades without resolving the core issue. Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that the Kresh are rational actors responding to resource scarcity rather than mindless destroyers. The Cephian ambassador's bioluminescent organs pulsed with irritation. The Xyloth position ignores the reality that some species simply cannot coexist peacefully with civilized societies. The Kresh have demonstrated repeatedly that they respond only to force. Because force is all we've offered them, the Xyloth countered. The debate spiraled into familiar patterns: hawks versus doves, military response versus diplomatic engagement, each side entrenched in positions they'd held for years. Smaller delegations tried to find middle ground and were ignored. Earth's position wasn't even requested. Then the Cephian ambassador said something that changed the tenor completely. Perhaps, he said, his tone dripping with false civility, we should acknowledge that some species, due to their cultural practices and historical experience, are naturally better suited to frontline combat roles. Species whose traditional values already embrace violence and sacrifice. The chamber went quiet. Everyone understood the implication. Talvirians, with their barbaric scarring rituals and warrior culture, should do the actual fighting while more civilized species remained safely distant. Velshara's ears flattened completely. The first time Vale had seen her display such obvious anger. But before she could respond, before the carefully maintained diplomatic calm could shatter, Vale's voice cut through the silence. Ambassador, I'm curious about your definition of barbaric. The Cephian turned, his bioluminescent organs shifting to surprise. Commander Vale, I wasn't addressing the Earth delegation. Nevertheless, I'd like clarification. Vale stood, aware that he was committing several protocol violations but beyond caring. Because from where I'm sitting, asking others to fight your battles while you remain safely distant seems far more primitive than the tradition of leaders bearing permanent marks of their service. The chamber erupted into whispers. The Cephian ambassador's organs pulsed rapidly. Anger, Vale thought, or maybe just shock that a representative from a minor species would challenge him so directly. Commander, you're new to galactic politics. Perhaps you don't understand the complexities. I understand that Queen Velshara has more combat experience against the Kresh than everyone in this room combined, Vale continued, his tone remaining diplomatic but firm. I also understand that dismissing her perspective because her culture makes you uncomfortable is spectacularly foolish. But please, continue explaining why the species with the most successful defensive record against the Kresh should follow strategic recommendations from species who have never actually faced them. It was a diplomatic grenade. The session devolved into arguments about protocol, Earth's presumption, proper procedures for raising objections. But Vale noticed something crucial. Several delegations who'd remained silent were now looking thoughtful. The smaller species, the ones usually ignored in favor of the major powers, were exchanging glances that suggested agreement. The session chair, a Xyloth elder, called for recess to allow tempers to cool and proper decorum to be restored. As delegates dispersed, Vale found himself suddenly isolated, the other major delegations avoiding him with the same careful distance they'd previously reserved for Velshara. He'd made himself radioactive. Earth's diplomatic corps was going to crucify him. Commander, Velshara materialized beside him, her presence causing the nearby delegates to scatter like water around a stone. A word, in private. They found a side corridor away from the main chambers, one of the station's maintenance passages where the organic technology that kept everything functioning pulsed visibly through transparent conduits. That was either very brave or very stupid, Velshara said. Vale leaned against the corridor wall, suddenly exhausted. History will probably say stupid, but I didn't spend 3 weeks learning to read Talvirian honor scars just to watch people disrespect what they represent. You've made enemies. I've made a statement, there's a difference. He looked at her directly. Your Majesty, can I ask you something personal? Her ears angled forward, curiosity. You've already committed diplomatic suicide on my behalf. Might as well complete the disaster. When was the last time someone asked you what you actually think we should do about the creche? Not what your military recommends, not what your advisors suggest. Your opinion. The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. Her ears cycled through several positions, surprise, uncertainty, something that might have been vulnerability. I'm the queen. My opinion is my people's policy. That's not what I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those amber eyes that seemed to look through surface pretense to something deeper. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of thoughts she'd clearly been holding for a long time. The creche aren't a unified threat. They're dozens of independent hive clusters operating without central coordination. Military force destroys individual clusters, but it doesn't address the core issue. They're consuming resources because their home territories have been depleted through centuries of expansion. We need a two-pronged approach. Military containment of active clusters while simultaneously establishing resource-sharing agreements with stable ones. Separate the aggressive swarms from those that might accept alternatives to constant expansion. Vale stared at her. That's actually brilliant, diplomatic and practical, addresses both security concerns and underlying causes. It's also politically unpopular. The Cephians want a military victory they can claim credit for. The Xyloth want peaceful solutions that avoid acknowledging some creche clusters are simply too far gone for negotiation. No one wants the complicated middle path that would actually work. No one except you and me, apparently. A hint of smile touched her features. A human commander and a scarred queen, quite the coalition. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms, not station emergencies, but security alerts that made the corridor's lighting shift to cautionary yellow. Through the transparent conduits, Vale could see the station's organic systems responding, resources redirecting to defense protocols. What's happening? He asked. Velshara was already accessing her datapad, her fingers moving through holographic displays with practiced speed. Creche scout ship detected in the system, close, too close for the quarantine zones. They ran, not toward their quarters but toward the station's strategic command center. Diplomatic protocol forgotten in favor of immediate threat response. The command center was chaos when they arrived. Multiple species military advisors crowding around holographic displays. The station commander trying to maintain order while fielding demands from panicking delegates. This is a secure facility, a guard started to say. I have 40 years of experience fighting the creche, Velshara said with the kind of authority that didn't accept refusal. You have surveillance data you don't know how to interpret. Either let us help or explain to your superiors why you rejected expert assistance during an active crisis. The station commander, a Xyloth named Thress, looked between them and the displays showing the creche scout ship. Whatever calculation he made, it came down in their favor. Fine, but stay out of the way if you can't contribute. Vale and Velshara moved to the displays, their different analytical approaches immediately complementing each other. She understood creche tactical patterns from decades of combat. He recognized data anomalies from his engineering background. There, Vale said, highlighting an energy signature near the lower docking arrays. That's not normal background radiation. Velshara zoomed the display, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. Kresh molecular markers. They're already here. The scout ship is a distraction. The real infiltration happened hours ago. During the opening ceremonies, Vale said, following the logic, when security was focused on delegate arrivals. They're not here for resources. Velshara pulled up communication logs, tracking data streams. They're harvesting intelligence. Every species' military capabilities, diplomatic positions, strategic weaknesses, all gathered in one location. The implications crashed through the command center like a physical wave. If the Kresh had been collecting Summit intelligence, every military secret, every strategic discussion, every vulnerability mentioned in private sessions, all of it could be transmitted to hive clusters across the region. Velshara made a command decision, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Seal the station. Full lockdown. Initiate organic matter scans on every level. Kresh infiltrators show distinctive bioelectrical signatures when they're in active data collection mode. I don't have authority, Thresh started. Then get someone who does, Velshara said. Every second we delay gives them more intelligence to transmit. Vale stepped in. Station regulations allow security lockdown if an active threat is confirmed on board. You've confirmed Kresh molecular signatures. That's your authority. Thresh looked between them. A human commander from a minor species, and a scarred queen most delegations avoided, and made his own calculation. He initiated the lockdown. The station's organic systems responded immediately. Bulkhead sealing, atmospheric controls isolating sections, security protocols engaging across all levels. The summit delegates erupted in outrage, demanding explanations, threatening political consequences, until the scans revealed 3 Kresh infiltrators disguised within the station's service infrastructure. Their organic forms had adapted to mimic environmental systems, practically invisible to standard security, but showing clearly on the specialized bioelectrical scans Velshara had recommended. The containment was swift. Talvirian security forces, who'd been present as the Queen's honor guard, neutralized the infiltrators with practiced efficiency. The threat was ended within minutes, but the damage was already done. The Kresh had been collecting data for at least 2 days. In the aftermath, as delegates were escorted back to secure quarters, and the station's security protocols were comprehensively overhauled, Vale found himself back in the command center with Velshara. They'd worked together seamlessly, her combat experience and his analytical skills creating a complete picture neither could have seen alone. "We make a good team," Vale said quietly. Velshara met his eyes across the command displays. "We do, which will terrify the diplomatic establishment once they realize it. Let them be terrified. Maybe they'll pay attention to the actual threats instead of worrying about who looks different." She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her features, making the scars seem less like marks of violence and more like what they were: evidence of survival, proof of service, history made permanent. "Thank you," she said simply, "for standing with me, for defending my people's honor, for seeing past what everyone else refuses to acknowledge." "Thank you for bringing me tea," Vale countered, "for trusting a human who barely knows what he's doing, for teaching me that understanding doesn't require similarity, just willingness to learn." Around them, the command center continued its post-crisis protocols, security teams moving with purpose, systems stabilizing, the immediate danger past. But something larger had shifted. The scarred queen and the human commander had saved the summit from a threat no one else had recognized. And in doing so, they'd proven that the most effective partnerships weren't built on similarity or comfort. They were built on mutual respect, complementary strengths, and the courage to stand together when others stood apart. It was a lesson the galaxy desperately needed to learn. The 4th day of the summit opened with the kind of controlled chaos that follows near disaster. Security protocols had been comprehensively revised, delegate quarters swept for additional infiltration, communication channels encrypted against Kresh data harvesting. But beneath the practical responses, political calculations were being recalibrated. Vale knew he was probably being recalled. Earth's diplomatic corps would never approve of a junior commander openly challenging major delegations, committing protocol violations, and inserting himself into security crises above his authority level. He'd hear about it soon enough. For now, he sat through another session, this one focused on lessons learned from the infiltration, which mostly meant various delegations trying to assign blame while avoiding responsibility. Then something unprecedented happened. The session chair recognized Commander Jackson Vale of Earth for a formal statement. Vale hadn't requested recognition. He certainly hadn't prepared remarks. But the chair's expression suggested this wasn't optional, so he stood, aware that every eye in the chamber was fixed on him. The Kresh infiltration revealed something crucial, he began, choosing his words carefully. They didn't come here to attack. They came to understand us, to learn our weaknesses, our divisions, our inability to work together effectively. He paused, looking around at the assembled delegates. And we're giving them exactly what they want. We're fractured, suspicious, more interested in political positioning than solving actual problems. The Cephian ambassador opened his mouth to interrupt, but the session chair gestured for silence. Queen Velshara suggested a two-pronged approach to the Kresh threat: containment and diplomacy, military force against aggressive clusters while establishing resource sharing with stable ones. It's the best strategy I've heard in 4 days of debate, but it's been ignored because her culture makes people uncomfortable. Vale walked to the center of the chamber, a breach of protocol, but he was already so far past protocol violations that one more hardly mattered. Every species here has something valuable to contribute: Talvirian combat experience, Xyloth diplomatic expertise, Cephian resource networks, even Earth's fresh perspective on interspecies cooperation. But we're too busy avoiding eye contact with anyone who looks different to actually build something that works. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Even the translation system seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was listening. The Kresh don't care about our political hierarchies or our cultural discomforts. They care about resources and survival, and unless we can overcome our own prejudices long enough to cooperate, they're going to keep picking us apart one system at a time. Vale met the Cephian ambassador's gaze directly. So maybe it's time we stopped treating different as dangerous and started recognizing it as the strategic advantage it actually is. He returned to his seat in absolute silence. Lieutenant Chen looked like he might faint, but Vale noticed several smaller delegations nodding, exchanging glances that suggested agreement. The session broke without formal resolution, but the energy had shifted. During the recess, Vale found himself approached by delegations he'd never spoken with before, smaller species asking questions about Velshara's proposed strategy, expressing interest in alternatives to the Cephian military plan. "You've started something," Velshara said, appearing at his elbow with her characteristic timing. "The question is whether it's a movement or a disaster." "History will tell," Vale said, "though I'm pretty sure Earth's recalling me for this." "Would that be so terrible, going home?" Vale thought about it, really thought about it, not just the reflexive answer but the honest one. "A month ago I would have said no, but now, I feel like I've found something here, something important. A diplomatic incident. Understanding, partnership, the sense that maybe what I'm doing actually matters." He met her eyes, and I'm not ready to give that up yet. That evening, Vale received the message he'd been expecting. Earth's diplomatic corps demanding explanation for his unauthorized interventions and protocol violations. But before he could compose a response, Minister Kelth appeared at his quarters with an urgent summons. "The Queen requests your presence," Kelth said, his unmarked face showing something that might have been respect. Several delegations have jointly proposed adopting her strategic framework. They want to discuss implementation. Vale followed Kelth through the station's corridors to a private conference room where Velshara waited with representatives from 6 species. Not the major powers, but mid-tier civilizations whose voices were usually drowned out by Cephian and Xyloth dominance. "Commander Vale," one of them said, a being whose species Vale's database identified as Mithrin. "Your speech today gave voice to concerns many of us have shared privately. Queen Velshara's approach addresses both security and humanitarian concerns. We'd like to propose it as the summit's official response to the Kresh threat." Vale looked at Velshara, who was watching him with an expression that suggested she was as surprised as he was. "That's unprecedented. The major delegations won't accept a strategy they didn't propose." "Then perhaps," the Mithrin said calmly, "it's time the major delegations learned that effective policy matters more than political pride. But we'll need both of you to co-chair the implementation committee. Your combined expertise, military and diplomatic, Talvirian experience and human perspective, would provide the leadership this initiative requires." It was a diplomatic revolution disguised as committee formation, and it would require Vale to remain at the summit indefinitely, essentially making him Earth's permanent liaison to this coalition. "Earth will never approve this," Vale said. "I've already exceeded every boundary of my mandate." "Then perhaps," Velshara said carefully, "Earth needs better information about what you've actually accomplished. I'll personally contact your diplomatic corps and explain your contributions. If they're reasonable beings, they'll recognize the strategic value of your continued participation." Minister Kelth, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "Your Majesty, formally aligning with Earth at this stage could be seen as choosing competence over politics," Velshara finished. "Yes, that's exactly how I want it seen." The meeting continued late into the station's artificial night, hammering out details of the proposed strategy, identifying resources each species could contribute, building the framework for actual cooperation. Vale found himself working alongside Velshara with the kind of seamless coordination that usually took years to develop, finishing each other's thoughts, anticipating analytical needs, building solutions neither could have reached alone. It felt right in a way Vale had never experienced before, not just professionally satisfying, but personally meaningful, as if all his training, all his experience, all the choices that had brought him to this moment had been building toward this partnership. 3 months later, the strategy was working. Kresh attacks had decreased by 40% as diplomatic channels opened with stable hive clusters, while military forces contained aggressive ones. The coalition that had formed around Velshara's framework had grown to include 17 species, creating the most effective interspecies cooperation the region had seen in decades. And Commander Jackson Vale, now Ambassador Jackson Vale, Earth having been convinced by both Velshara's endorsement and the strategic victories he'd been part of, found himself working alongside the Talvirian Queen on a daily basis. Their partnership had become something the galaxy noticed but struggled to categorize. Not romance, though some tabloid data feeds tried to spin it that way, but something deeper. Mutual respect that had grown into genuine friendship, shared understanding of leadership's weight, the kind of connection that emerges when two people who have carried burdens alone discover someone who comprehends that load. Vale stood in the Talvirian royal complex on Kethris Prime, having been invited for strategic meetings that had become increasingly frequent. The complex was beautiful, crystalline architecture that resonated with the planet's magnetic fields, creating harmonics that made the entire structure seem alive. He found Velshara in a private garden where plants grew in patterns that echoed her scars, spirals and parallel lines rendered in living geometry. She was reviewing tactical reports, but set them aside when he approached. "I've been thinking," Vale said, settling onto a bench designed for Talvirian physiology but accommodating enough for humans. About what you said at the summit. About the loneliness of carrying your people's history. Productive thoughts, I hope. Maybe, I was wondering, have you ever considered that the loneliness wasn't because you chose the scars? Maybe it was because you were surrounded by people who'd forgotten how to read them. Velshara's ears angled forward, genuine attention, meaning. Your younger advisors, the ones who reject traditional marking, they've lost the context that makes the scars meaningful. They see disfigurement because they've forgotten the language written on your skin. But the problem isn't the scars. It's the collective amnesia about what they represent. She was quiet, considering. Around them, the crystalline plants chimed softly in the breeze, their harmonics creating music from mathematics. "And you think you can read that language?" she asked. "After 3 months?" "No," Vale admitted. "I think I'm still learning the alphabet. But I'm willing to spend however long it takes to become fluent, if you'll teach me." What had begun as mutual respect at a diplomatic summit had transformed into something neither of them had quite planned for. Not romance, but partnership in its deepest form. The kind that emerges when two people who have carried leadership's weight alone discover someone who understands that burden, who sees past surface differences to recognize genuine value. They were still from different species, different cultures, different worlds. But in the space between warrior queen and human ambassador, they'd found something the galaxy desperately needed more of. Genuine understanding built on choice rather than comfort, respect earned through attention rather than demanded through protocol. The garden's harmonics shifted as the planet's rotation changed the magnetic fields, and the crystalline plants sang a new song. Velshara stood, gesturing for Vale to follow her to the tactical displays that never truly stopped demanding attention. "The Joint Council is meeting in an hour," she said. "New intelligence about Kresh hive cluster movements in the outer rim. Then we should review the data before they arrive." They walked together through the royal complex, their movements synchronized from months of collaboration, guards and advisors parting to let them pass. Vale noticed Minister Kelth watching them with an expression that had transformed over these months from concern to something like pride. The scars that had isolated Velshara for 20 years were still there, permanent and profound. But now someone read them correctly, saw honor where others had seen horror, recognized service where others had seen barbarism, understood that different didn't mean dangerous. And in learning to read the language written on a warrior queen's face, a human ambassador had discovered that sometimes the most important diplomatic achievement isn't building alliances between governments. It's building understanding between individuals. The galaxy still whispered about the scarred queen. But now those whispers included the human who'd learned to see her truly, who'd stood beside her when others stood apart, who'd proven that respect doesn't require similarity, only the courage to look past surface differences to recognize genuine worth. It was a lesson that would ripple outward from this partnership, changing how species interacted, how differences were perceived, how understanding could be built through choice rather than forced through circumstance. But for now, in this moment, it was simply two leaders walking together toward the next crisis, the next challenge,